Hello, 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 everybody. Hi. My name is Lainey Rose, and I'm the events manager here at East City Bookshop. It is wonderful to be with you all today in person, and for those attending virtually as well, thank you for joining us. We always have something on the calendar here, and we have 10 different author events on the calendar in May. And 2 weeks from today, we'll be hosting Bridget Reed for her book, Little Bosses Everywhere, a work history and reportage that unveils the stranger than fiction world of multi level marketing. All the information about the upcoming events and our 14 different book clubs can be found on our website. Before we get to tonight's event, some housekeeping details. Number one, if you could take a moment to silence your cell phones, we would appreciate it. Number two, if you need a restroom, it's upstairs past the cash registers and the greeting cards. Number three, we will have time for questions tonight for both in-person and virtual attendees. So even if you're watching via Zoom, you can participate. Please put those questions in the Q&A feature so that we can see them and can ask on your behalf. And finally, most importantly, if you still need to purchase a copy of tonight's book, we have copies available upstairs at the register, and they can be purchased prior to the signing line. And now the reason we're here tonight. With Mother's Day this weekend, we can think of no better time to discuss Abigail Leonard's page-turning narrative of four real women from Finland, Japan, the US, and Kenya in their first year of motherhood. As nations around the world debate programs like paid leave, universal daycare, reproductive health care, and family tax incentives, For Mothers offers a uniquely intimate, moving portrait of what those policies mean for parents on the ground and considers what modern families really want. Our author of the evening is Abigail Leonard, who is an international reporter and news producer, previously based in Tokyo, where she was a frequent contributor to NPR, Time Magazine, and the New York Times Video. Joining her in conversation is Ali Rogin, a correspondent from the PBS NewsHour and PBS News Weekend, reporting on a number of topics, including foreign affairs, healthcare, arts, and culture. And now please join me in welcoming our guests of the evening. Big round of applause! Da 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 da!
This is my first event. Yeah, this is very exciting. Thank you for coming. Yeah, it's great.
I met Abigail talking about, speaking about motherhood. I met her at a very specific time in my motherhood journey. I had just done our first embryo transfer that resulted in my check. Okay, excellent. Thank you. Resulted in my now 2.5-year-old daughter, and Abigail and Peter and their family had just moved back from Japan. And now she has birthed this incredible book. So I'm super excited to be able to facilitate the conversation tonight. And Abigail's going to kick us off with a reading from the book.
Thank you. And really, thank you all for being here. It's so nice to be here and to be able to share this with you. It's been a very long process. Okay, so I'm going to read from part of the Japanese woman's story, and this is sort of after she's gone home to Osaka with her baby. And her baby's name is Rota. For Rota's first Golden Week, the spring holiday when cities empty as people escape to the countryside, Tsukasa's mother comes to visit. In the days leading up to her arrival, Tsukasa is anxious with anticipation, still feeling the effect of their disagreements in Matsumoto. When she finally arrives, she looks at Rota, resting in a baby bouncer on the floor with her chubby legs in a perfect butterfly, and remarks on how much the baby has grown since they were last together. Tsukasa smiles and invites her mother to sit with her on the gray couch next to Rota. Yes, Rota-chan, you're big now, Tsukasa sings to her, and the baby smiles broadly. Rota also has more personality now. There's a little rattle she prefers, and she lets Tsukasa know when she wants it and when she's losing her patience. Tsukasa thinks it's a healthy sign she's developing her own sense of self. I brought these for her, her mother says, pulling out several graphic books. She flips through the pages filled with bright spirals and stripes. And do you remember this one? It's a book from Tsukasa's own childhood. The multicolored cover opens a portal in time. It reminds her, Tsukasa tells her mother gently, of aspects of her childhood she might have changed. She's been waiting for the opportunity to say this. I think we have a slightly different approach to parenthood, Tsukasa explains, as they sit side by side on the couch. I think you saw me as your possession, to be controlled. And so I think that's where we differ. Her mother is silent, reflecting on what Tsukasa has said. Looking back on when I was raising you, she finally responds, I suppose it is true that I thought of you as my property. She pauses and looks down at her hands crossed in her lap. Perhaps I should not have done that. Sukasa sits in that right moment, filled with aching joy. She studies her mother's face, older now, though her short hair is still dark, with the same straight bangs she's always had. It seems that at last she has mellowed. Thank you for saying that, Tsukasa tells her. I think it's something I only really understand now with Rotachan. They look at the baby banging her rattle lightly on the side of her chair, responsible somehow for this progress between them. You know, Sukasa goes on, I hope someday I'll be able to say I'm sorry to Rota, like you did for me, when she tells me she didn't like things that I did as a mom. Her mother smiles, happy it seems to finally be an example Sukasa hopes to emulate. Their conversation is part of a larger evolution for Sukasa. She has found the strength to tell her mother how she feels, but she's also more sympathetic to how her mother must have struggled with this phase of her own life after her father moved out and her mother was largely responsible for child raising. Single motherhood has always been difficult here. Women are largely excluded from higher paying positions, so it's hard for them to support a family. Almost half of all single parent families live below the poverty line, one of the highest rates among developed nations. Sukasa has struggled to find a balance between maintaining her career goals and taking care of Rota, and she has the benefit of Kaz, her husband's sympathy and devotion, as well as his income. It was probably harder for her mother at a time when there were even fewer supports for mothers. That evening, as Sukasa's sterilizing bottles, Rhoda begins to cry. She'd been happily playing on the floor but is suddenly distraught, so Sukasa hurries to finish one last bottle as the baby's wails intensify. Sukasa finally scoops Rhoda's soft little body in her arms, and the room stills. Maybe because of her earlier conversation with her mom, a vivid memory engulfs her of crying for her own mother and not getting what she needed. But as she comforts Rhoda, that feeling of abandonment eases. In that moment, I got inner healing of my unfulfilled desire, Sukasa says. She could see the tableau from both sides, she explains, as the child crying for affection, but also the mother pulled in two directions. Her mom had been so overwhelmed by daily life, she simply didn't have time to hold Sukasa every time she cried. Something inside me changed, thinking about what it was like for my mom when I was a child, Tsukasa says. And it paved the way for forgiveness and a new kind of love. My mother's amazing. The way I look at all mothers has changed. If, as psychotherapist Daphne DeMarniff writes, every woman's feminism is a love letter to her mother, then a society's feminism begins at a primal level. In the most hopeful scenario, the next generation of women will work to repair the parts of the system that mistreated their own mothers and fight for better policies that will give them and their daughters the best chance at happiness.
Thank you so much, Abigail. It's so beautiful. Um, One of the things that I take away from that passage and really is a through line through the whole book is the idea of what you describe as aching joy that Tsukasa feels in this moment when she's experiencing this kind of outside of time, you know, journey of healing her inner child and understanding her mother in a different way. And that's really something that all four of the women, all four of the mothers, has a similar experience with in one way or another. And another passage that really also resonates, I think, in the same way is when we talked about this yesterday when I interviewed Abigail for the News Hour. It airs this weekend. But this idea of child rearing being a way to, to heal past trauma. And so I'd like to ask about, um, it's so interesting to me that they all find a way to explore that in their own journeys. Is that something that, do you think that's inherent to motherhood? Did it have to do with the individual experiences of these women? How did they all arrive at these healing journeys during such a difficult, first year of motherhood?
Yeah, it's true. And I mean, it obviously wasn't something that I set out knowing was going to happen. I mean, I met them sort of when they were all pregnant and then followed them through their journeys. But it certainly was true that a lot of them, and particularly in relation to their own mothers, I think there was sort of an initial commonality when they sort of suddenly realized that they had this new identity of mother. And that was sort of a universal thing. And it was really remarkable to see it happening sort of both in, in Nairobi, Kenya, and then in, Osaka, Japan, and just this sort of like immediate, I don't know, sort of out of body experience that they all sort of went through, and then how they processed it. I mean, it was different and they were going through very different things. Chelsea, the woman in Kenya, had actually just lost her mother. So for her, you know, motherhood was, she was grieving at the same time as she was welcoming this new life. And there was some part of that that was healing for her. And Sukasa, the passage I just read, she underwent, abuse as a child that was sort of all the pain of childbirth and stuff brought up again. And so it was really interesting to see, for each one of them, there was something like that, that it brought up some sort of emotion for them that was traumatic. And then it allowed them, and I mean, it's not, motherhood is not a cure for all trauma, but it was interesting to watch sort of how it helped them process some of these things and process their relationships with their moms. I mean, it was really pretty remarkable.
It was so cool and just so organic in the way you describe it. I mean, as I was reading it, I was thinking like, I wish I hadn't had to go through motherhood to like appreciate my mom on that level, but I think in many ways, like you have to.
Yeah.
Taking a step back, there's the similarities between each story and the way that in some ways motherhood is universal is so interesting because we're talking about such different geographical locations and cultural standpoints. And of course, there are lots and lots of differences from both, the policies of the governments and the countries in which these women live. There's differences in societal expectations. So let's just talk for a minute about some of the experiences that really you found to be universal in all of their first years.
Yeah, I mean, there was that sort of initial shock at sort of what was happening. There was also, there were some things that were sort of universal, but also based on circumstance. So I noticed that, so the woman in the US and the woman in Kenya both were sort of estranged from their communities for different reasons. They the woman in the US was a former LDS church member and was leaving it and just decided that she wanted to raise her children completely differently. But that meant for her, she was cut off from, all the sort of supports that her own mother had in the church. And for Chelsea in Kenya, there was sort of a breakdown of some of these ties to her community that was happening as more people moved to the cities and away from the sort of the ancestral homeland. So for both of them, they shared these somewhat lonely experiences with motherhood. And for both of them, they became like completely obsessed with the weight of their children, like how much their babies weighed. And they seemed to have no one to like reassure them that, I mean, they would go to the public health clinics in the case of Kenya, and Sarah would like go online to Facebook or whatever and like ask her questions, which was such an American way of sort of addressing
I
the
literally, when I
situation.
was reading that passage, I wrote in the notes as I was taking notes, I was like, oh no,
Yeah.
she logged onto Facebook. Like, this is not good. Go back, Sarah. It's a trap.
It's so true. You could like
Yeah.
see it happening. She's just
Yeah.
getting deeper and deeper.
Yeah.
And they both sort of like spiraled in this way. And they didn't have the sort of collective knowledge that I think maybe other generations had had. So they were turning to these other sources, and it was, making them both like completely overwrought and anxious.
Yeah, and you observe this thing where they were obsessing about the weight because it was like a way to have some control over a very obviously chaotic, uncontrollable set of circumstances. And I thought that was really, really interesting. And there's so many differences. Obviously, there's the kind of superficial cultural differences. There's a lot that you can see about the experience of a mother in the differences in policies around parenthood and child rearing in each country. So I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about how to kind of organize those experiences. So I'm wondering, what did you observe about differences within each of these experiences that kind of rose to the top for you?
Yeah. I thought a lot of it had to do with sort of the policies that they had access to, which was really interesting and sort of speaks to how important these policies are. So, like the women in Finland and Japan, they both had very generous paid leave. So they were both there for, it was 9 months and a year. So they were home with their new babies for that long. And they never went through the sort of stress. Both the woman in Kenya and the US went back to work at 3 months, which is generous for the US. But it wasn't fully paid, and it was fully paid in Kenya because it's nationally guaranteed that way. So they were sort of, stressed out about going back to work and having to breast pump, which was a big deal for both of them. And in Kenya, the woman is like, she's supposed to have a place to pump. She can't find a place to pump. She's in this like filing cabinet at work, filing closet, sorry, filing closet at work. And someone walks in on her, she's like half naked. I mean, and it's just the whole thing is sort of terrible. And for Sarah in Utah, she has to share a room with 6 other nursing mothers. She's like very cool about the whole thing. Like, well, I just do it. I, have a time slot and that's when I go. But the women in the other countries that had longer paid leave, they never used breast pumps. And so they just went right back to work. I mean, at the end of a year, and it sort of transitioned back. And in Finland, it was a much more sort of flexible transition back. But you could see how just the sort of day-to-day stress of like having to find time to pump, and Chelsea missed her lunch break that first day and then had been walked in on by a colleague. I mean, all this sort of like mini traumas of motherhood and all of that stuff sort of doesn't exist if you have guaranteed paid leave. I mean, stuff like that really makes a huge difference.
Exactly. Once more for the folks in the back, guaranteed me. So another, what I loved about the way that you laid this book out is you go through each experience and, you read a couple like scenes from each mom, and then you go to the next mom, and then you're like left on a cliffhanger. So it's very exciting and it makes you want to read the whole thing in one fell swoop. But they have, there are kind of like, they seem like milestone markers of experiences, and you see the way that each of them experience this one thing differently. And so what I mean by that is like in Sukasa's experience in Japan, you wrote about how the cultural expectation, which is reflected in the policy, is that a new mom is going to get help from her family. And then you look at the experience in Finland, where there's much more expectation that there will be third-party assistance, whether that's, I believe, access to mental health counselors is part of it. Right. Also, nurse practitioners is a big thing, less so the doctors, and more about like that kind of interpersonal interaction. And so there's all these, and so I'm curious about that in particular, this idea of like, whose job is it to be the village for these moms? And it seemed like they each kind of had their own journey with that proposition.
Yeah. No, that's a really good observation. It's true because you have these robust systems, but they work differently. Like, so in Finland, it's true that I thought it was so remarkable. They have this thing where you go and get a counseling session before you give birth, and it's, to talk about your own childhood and what you want to bring forward and what you don't want to bring forward. And it was this way to heal intergenerational trauma. It was like, wow, like I can't even imagine.
And also the men had their own kind of thing, right?
A pilot program for men to do it. Can you imagine? So
like, what? The men?
Yeah. So that was really interesting. And then right. And everything was sort of public. You're assigned a public health nurse who follows you and your child and, through school age or something. So you see the same person for a long time. And then, in Japan, it is more sort of family based in a lot of ways. The mother of the birthing mother takes care of her for a month. So Sukasa went home and her own mom took care of her, which was, as you can imagine, like both wonderful and stressful. They get into this whole thing about like whether or not she should breastfeed and whether she should use formula. And they're, Sukasa, it's fine, just give her formula, and like Sukasa's like, they told me at the hospital not to. And they just saw them like all these little things. So it was hard. And there was actually, interestingly, a study that compared I can't remember if it was like happiness or how they, did it, but between Finnish mothers and Japanese moms. And it was like the Finnish moms were actually much happier to sort of get their help from the public outside source and not have to depend on their moms, which was interesting. And I mean, I think even I interviewed a nurse in Japan who sort of like said something to that, like it can be hard sometimes with the moms, and it's hard for the, the grandmothers too. It's a lot on them. And the other interesting thing that I realized when I moved to Japan is they don't use a lot of babysitters. I mean, it's just really not done culturally.
Yeah.
So it's the grandmother who does all of that caregiving work too, which is like, again, a sort of a big ask of them to be, all the caregiver. So and of course for the mom not to be able to use babysitters. So, right. So there's all this sort of, yeah, different ways of supporting the mother and different ways that it works better or not.
Yeah, and another way that this manifests itself in terms of like all common kind of things that these moms had to deal with, but the very different ways in which they had access to options to deal with them, I thought was on the issue of childcare. In Kenya, uh, I believe, most people like above the poverty line maybe had access to domestic work. Which I thought was really interesting. And then, of course, obviously the situation in the United States, where for Sarah in Utah, it was so expensive. It was almost, she was debating between putting her child in daycare or driving an hour to her parents' house to have them take care of the baby. Then you have in Japan where the idea of like you want someone else to take care of your kid, like, didn't she have to like go and like answer questions about why she couldn't take care of her child?
Yeah, there was one public service that would do it, and you had to like schedule a month in advance, and you had to sort of like justify it. And she was like, I want to get my driver's license. I need to go take driving classes.
Right. And the idea that you had to like have something specific, not just like I need a minute to like take a shower. Like it's it's interesting. And then in Finland, there was also a lot of focus on the family, I think, honestly, in that area of it. So talk to us about, what you learned about childcare in this process of writing this book.
Right. Yeah, it seems super critical. Obviously, as like anyone with children knows, I mean, it's such a major part of having a kid is figuring out childcare. And yeah, so Japan and Finland both have daycare, public daycare starting at, well, I mean, you can start it very early, but most people don't until they go back to work. So about a year old. And that makes that situation a lot better. But outside of that, there's not a lot of other support. But then it was interesting to see in the US, right? She can't afford it. Her parents have to step in and take care of the baby. And, it's a reason that she's thinking about not having another child because it's so expensive, which is obviously a problem, if we want people to be able to have the number of kids they want and they can't afford childcare. It's a major issue. So her story really spoke to that. And I was talking to people who work in the childcare space, and they were saying it was really overlooked in places like Kenya for a long time. Like the NGOs sort of were focused on other things. It wasn't sort of in anyone's head until COVID, when all these people working in Western organizations had the same problem. They couldn't get childcare, and they were like, "Oh, this is really going to keep women from working and from entering the workforce." It turns out,
what do you know? Like,
yeah. Huh. So then it sort of realigned things a little. Now there's been a much bigger push, and Melinda Gates is doing some really great work on this. And it's just they are now going to local government officials and saying this is going to help you with your your economy. They're making an economic argument, not a humanitarian argument, but this is the way that it's.
And it's so interesting how that played out in terms of like that discovery. It had to, we had to wait until there was a moment where like both men and women, mothers and fathers were affected by this problem. Right. And that also is something that I think, so many of the drivers of the changes that result in, better conditions for moms in these countries, they all seem to happen after long periods of just like absence of the perspective of the mother on the public stage.
Yeah, that seems right. I mean, if you look also at, the one time that we had universal childcare in this country, it was during World War II.
This was so wild, this stuff. Sorry. Like this was like one of my favorite parts of the book.
It's so crazy. Yeah. So and some people may know this, but during World War II, we had essentially universal childcare, and it was because women had to work, and for the war effort, it was really important, finally that women joined the workforce. And so they set up these really incredible centers all across the country. They invested like what would today be billions of dollars. They were feeding kids. They were doing all sorts of great stuff. And then the war ended, and the government basically said, we're going to discontinue this. And parents got like irate, and they went and protested in the streets, men and women, I think. And they were out there saying, we want to keep our childcare. Women were even offering to pay something for it. It was just because it was, had been such a great thing for them. And part of the reason that they didn't end up doing it was because the federal government sort of assigned 2 offices to look at this. And one of the offices wanted was responsive to southern states that wanted the daycares to be segregated, and they couldn't decide if the daycare should be segregated. And then the whole thing sort of fell apart. And so we lost universal childcare. I mean, it was just like, I mean, American in the most tragic sense. And then, again, it came up in the 70s with Nixon. Women at that point were joining the workforce in greater numbers. So again, there was a need for it. And he campaigned in 1968 on having public childcare, and there was this huge movement for it. And both houses of Congress passed it. But then the sort of conservative right revolted, and the churches mounted a letter writing campaign, and they said, we don't want this, women belong in the home. And there was all this sort of rhetoric around, it's like going to Sovietize our youth or something, like the idea, having all the kids in the same daycare centers is a bad idea. It's communist and stuff. And he ended up caving, and he vetoed it after he had promised to do it, and called it like the most radical piece of legislation that that Congress had produced. I mean, and that was it. And then after that, my sense, I talked to a woman who was sort of pushing for this stuff as a feminist in the 70s, and she said, like, we were just so deflated. Like, we decided, okay, childcare, we can't go back to like fighting for this anymore. It was just so upsetting. And so they made other things a priority, but childcare sort of got pushed to the side. And so now what we have is a system that's totally, essentially privatized, and private equity is getting involved, and it's very expensive. And then you have women like Sarah who can't afford it and are not going to have the number of kids that they want. I mean, it's really just, yeah.
Yeah, and it's another conundrum that you really get at throughout the book is this idea that like the conversation around demanding accessible, affordable child care is this idea that like if you do that, if you accept that women like and men just deserve and are like, should have the right to have a family if they want one, that becomes tied to a conversation about, as you put it, like essentializing women's work as like a domestic endeavor.
Yeah.
And then it becomes very difficult to, once you open that door of like, you're talking about children becoming part of the equation, it seems very difficult to then say, okay, but now we're talking about moms being outside of the home and like providing those options for them. Has any country, I mean, where do you see that playing out? And I don't want to get into, and I know it's important to you not to like really try to compare and contrast these experiences necessarily, but who is doing the work of being able to like put in place these policies that support motherhood, but aren't necessarily like essentializing the work of motherhood as women's work.
Right. That's what I thought was interesting to compare Japan and Finland, because they both have really incredible social safety nets, and but they have completely different ideas about the roles of men and women. And so, I think what you learn from looking at Japan is that public services can only go so far if you don't have sort of egalitarian relationships at home and, in the rest of society. Sukasa, the woman I followed, she had all these great benefits. She had these community centers. I would go visit them. I mean, it was amazing. They were like free, and they were staffed by, volunteers, and there were public health nurses who would come and help you. And the idea was to bring mothers together. It was like lovely in so many ways. But at the same time, her husband was always working. He was never around. And that was because of just sort of the work culture there. And this is all sort of post World War II, the salaryman and the professional housewife, basically. And so that archetype still exists, even though women are working. There's more women in the workforce in Japan than in the US now, I think in the last couple of years, which is incredible, but they're still doing 7 times the housework at home as men. So it's just really, really hard. And then in Finland, it's not as, I feel like Finland seems perfect. There are, things that are, but they've really thought about the egalitarian stuff, and how much there's this idea that fathers have a right to time with their children, and children have a right to time with their fathers. And so, the men also are pushing for this time. They get generous paid leave, and they actually take it. Whereas in Japan, men get generous paid leave and don't take it. And so that intersection of culture and policy, I think, is really crucial.
And you mentioned, again, the post-war dynamics that are still at play. And that was another fascinating theme throughout the book, is that so much of the conversation around population growth, birth rates, how we view parenthood was tied up with war.
Yeah.
and in the case of Kenya, more colonialism, occupation, but that very explicitly these policies and attitudes were established due to martial posture. That was wild.
I know. It was so crazy. Even Finland, which I've been praising this whole time, they started some of these policies because they needed more people to fight Russia, like Russian incursion. So they were trying to like produce a bigger population. So they really invested in nursing care for mothers in order to increase the birth rate. And this was, very long. It was over 100 years ago that they started that program. But yeah, so
And they'd
even,
say, what was the phrase that they'd say if they were like
oh, it's like
contemplating a third
a
child?
third for the fatherland.
Yeah, like
Yeah, right.
yeah,
No, it's
yeah.
true. And then after Japan, it was the same way. They needed more people to reinvigorate the economy. So they, put in place a lot of these policies. I mean, the other interesting thing about that in terms of the war stuff was the mother's role in World War II during, in Japan. They were it was called martial motherhood, and they were sort of essentially asked to send their kids off to war with no tears. It was like, you send your young sons to war in this brutal battle. I mean, these were like, some of them were like kamikaze pilots, this was like terrible stuff. And so these moms would in public have this like stoic face. And then there were these reports of them doing things like talking to stones as if they were their sons to like say how much they miss them and stuff. I mean, there was all this stuff. And then so after the war, they wanted to reclaim motherhood. And so they wanted to be able to do it their way and not have it imposed by the state. And so in some ways, there's this sort of veneration of motherhood that it's really important and that you should be able to do it the way that you want to do it. That I realized I had sort of missed when I was living there. I thought it was just this sort of essentialism around gender roles and mothers, but in fact, it was sort of a real respect for like the role of mothers that, I really thought was incredible. So yeah, I mean, the war plays into it in so many ways.
Yeah, and in the case of Japan, just so hard fought, they had to really, this idea that like we're gonna just love on our sons and like have
Yeah,
babies just because we want to have children.
right.
They're not for you. We want the government to serve us instead of like us
Yeah.
serving the government through childbirth.
Yes,
It's pretty
exactly.
wild.
Yeah.
Um, these women all have, you write about their partners as well, and they're super interesting. Um, you know, without giving too much away, I told you this yesterday, but like there were some of the fathers in the book that I was like yelling at through the pages. I was like, and you know, um, they're all obviously going through their own journeys as well. But one of the things that's interesting is like, regardless of the partner that these women have, they all kind of realize, they all come to sort of the same realization that like they're experiencing many parts of this alone.
Mm.
They're, it's you and me, kid. And so let's just talk for a minute about the role that these partners played.
Yeah. It was limited. Like I was surprised given everything going into it.
Right.
Like,
And I mean, you
yeah.
didn't like plan that.
No.
I mean, you didn't know when you,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, things started off and then,
yeah.
and then it seemed like a lot of them just sort of retreated in different ways. Chelsea's the father of her child, sort of he didn't come to the birth, and that was like the first sign, like
And
this
in,
is
in
not
their
going
case,
well.
the relationship was out of wedlock, but like
Right.
he had told her that, he was
Exactly.
separated, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And she sort of had these expectations, and then he just didn't deliver. And she had her own issues with her own father abandoning her, and so she just sort of was like ever hopeful that she could create a different thing for her child. And so that was really hard. And then yeah, I talked about Tsukasa in Japan and Kaz, her husband. He he was like I think he did really want to be there for
Oh
her.
yeah, I
He
think
was
that comes
just
across. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, and he was so kind. Like he would give interviews to me and stuff and talk about it, and he was so appreciative of what she was doing. But he just was sort of locked in this society that didn't let him do what he wanted to do, and he wanted to be different than his own father. His father was a brain surgeon and was never around and had this really intense job. So then he went and he's a composer. He was composing music. He's like this very sensitive person, but it was the music industry is tough and he was always working. So he wasn't around a lot. It was really hard for her. Um, and then yeah, in Finland, their relationship just completely deteriorated. I mean, and it was partly because of the gender role stuff. Like he was not from Finland and he couldn't get into the egalitarian way of doing things. And she just sort of got fed up. And I think because she had so much public support, she was able to do what she wanted and get out of that
I
relationship.
mean, can you
Yeah.
imagine like what the situation would be in the United States if there were there was more support for like
Yeah.
outside of a toxic situation,
Right.
for these women to have, because it really does seem, I mean, that situation got pretty bad,
Yeah.
and they were really able to use the resources that the state made available to
Hmm.
get through a lot of it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. She
yeah,
recognized that. She was very
yeah,
appreciative. I mean, she was able to like have the life she wanted because she lived in Finland. I mean, because she had all those services. Um, and then they also were able to like, figure out a way to go forward. And he did have a relationship with his son in the end. And so it sort of worked out. Um, and then the one in the US was sort of complicated as well. Yeah. So they were former LDS and he came out to her as being bisexual. And then it turned out that he wanted to be in a sort of open polyamorous relationship. I mean, there's like everything in this book, I'm telling you.
yeah.
So-
No, it really runs the gamut.
Yeah.
I mean, it was interesting to me that she never had her own. I mean, I know in a poly relationship there, and they were very like deliberate about it, and ethical polyamory was a big part of it.
Yeah.
But it was interesting to me that he had several partners throughout the narrative that you lay out, and she didn't have any that were sort of
Yeah.
like hers. So that was interesting to me.
Yeah.
Anyway, but let's see. Um, yeah, we're so start thinking about, if you have any questions, because we will be taking some questions, but I mean, let's talk about the situation in the United States. There's only a handful of Pacific Islander countries that don't have um, a national policy of paid leave, and the United States.
Yeah.
So, uh this book is narrative driven. You're telling the stories of these women, but I know that you were able to make a lot of observations, and you learned a lot about what works, what doesn't, and how you get to that place of having policies that do work. So
Right.
I mean, are we even in the same universe as having the conditions to arrive at a place where we're once again having serious conversations about a national paid leave policy?
I mean, we're in a tough place right now, obviously.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think one thing that I thought was really interesting to think about was you sort of think about income inequality here and in Kenya, but it was also very obvious how much there was sort of an inequality of benefits. So there are women in the US who have great benefits. You work for a tech company, you have 6 months paid leave or whatever it is. You have, maybe access to childcare or whatever, you're through your employer, and you sort of exist in this different country than a lot of the other people here. And it's almost like you have, like what the woman in Finland had in some ways. And then you have people like Sarah who sort of had nothing. And it was, her husband, it was an Amazon delivery driver. He had no paid leave. He had to burn through his sick days just to take a couple days off. But had he been in Amazon management, he would have had like a few months. So it did strike me, and it was the same in Kenya. There's just, this public-private system. Some women in Kenya give birth, and it would look like, a woman in Europe giving birth or something at a hospital. I mean, it's very similar. But other women, and I talked to a doctor there who delivers babies there, they deliver babies in a shared room in a shared bed. So it's like you're delivering babies, there's just hundreds of people in this ward giving birth. I mean, and it's so different, just what the experience is like. And so I think it's worth thinking about that and thinking about like maybe it does make it hard to sort of come together in activism if some people already have the benefits that you would be asking for. And the other thing that was interesting, I talked to a congressman about this, and he was saying that he had tried to get some of the tech companies sort of on board with a paid leave, backing a paid leave policy. And they basically said like maybe childcare, maybe something else, but paid leave, it's like something we use as a recruitment tool. And so we don't really want to like it's basically a competitive advantage. They can get the best employees, people want to work there, and it leaves small businesses at a complete disadvantage, if people might want to work at like a little coffee shop, but then they have a baby, they need to go take a job at Target instead or something. You know, it really sort of messes with the ecosystem. So yeah.
That's so interesting, right? If everybody has it, we can't highlight it as like a benefit, which is kind of perverted, right? Like that's, I mean, not perverted like gross. I mean, like
Yeah.
a perversion of the way the system is supposed to work. Um, uh, my last, oh yeah, sorry. My last point and kind of thing I want to get your thoughts on before we move to some questions from the audience, um, is uh, sorry, I'm really losing my train of thought here. Sorry, guys. It's been a long day. The idea that like in the conversation about advocacy, particularly in this country, um, having young children and like talking about these policies, I think you made this point that like it's only on the top of mind for many of the people in positions to be making these policies for a short period of time because children are only children for so long. And then when you're out of it, you might not necessarily feel an immediate need to change the system. And when you're out of it, you're kind of out of it forever.
Right.
So is that the issue here? I mean, certainly for more reasons than that, it seems like it's important to have younger people in positions of power. But like, I mean, do you think that would change it if just like more people were more like directly impacted at the time that they're in a position to make the change?
I think that's possible. I think, yeah, like people, representatives who actually represent sort of the broad cross section of the US, which includes young people, would be obviously great. The other thing that I think, I also just lost my train of thought about this. Oh, what was I going to say? Sorry.
No, that's okay. I mean, it seems like you talk a lot about like the dad's caucus and how like
Oh,
that's
this is
really
the thing I wanted to
changing.
say. Yeah. So there's
Yeah.
the dad's caucus. The other thing, right, that he represents is like allyship. So what you need is, dads, men. You also need, younger women who don't have kids yet or who may not want kids, to join in this as like part of the women's movement, thinking about mothers, the reproductive movement, all of that stuff. I think people who are sort of, yeah, I think allies are just a really important part because mothers of young children are so incredibly busy. The idea that they need to get out and advocate for themselves. And then it is true, you get kind of burnt out. And by the time you're done, you're like, ooh, like,
Like, thank God that's
moving right
over.
along.
Like,
Yeah.
not that you want to, pull the rug up under when you're done, pull the ladder up, but like you kind of, yeah, you're
You
kind of
just are
exhausted.
tired. Yeah. So I think allies are really important. And the dad's caucus is, yeah, that's like at least a good model.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's open it up to some questions. Who has questions for Abigail? And we also have some folks watching online. So if any of them have questions, we'll take those. So Abigail, yes.
That's a good question. It's usually the first question, actually.
I was gonna, and I was gonna ask that. So I'm
No,
glad
that's
you
good.
did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad yeah,
Oh, yes, sorry. So the question was, how did you arrive at
fine.
finding and picking these four women?
So I knew sort of where I wanted geographically, like to represent the different parts of the world. And I wanted middle class moms, first time moms, urban environments so that it was sort of representative of most mothers in the world. And they had to be having a baby in January 2022. So it was like a very limited, narrow group of people. But in the US, I actually posted in mothers forums, which like not surprisingly, I found Sarah because that was, that's where she was later. She was also, yeah. And then in the other countries, I worked with local journalists, like local fixers, and they helped me find the women. And I mean, I was really grateful to them for doing that because, as I said, it was such a specific ask that I was looking for. And then I talked to, in a couple cases, I talked to a few people, and they just ended up being the most sort of compelling speakers and stories. Yeah.
And I mean, your reporting is so thorough, and I just wonder, like, was it weird for you and your collaborators to like be involved in so many intimate moments between these couples and families?
Yeah, I was sort of amazed by how open they were and how willing they were to let me in. And I think at some point, it just sort of became normal. I followed them for a full year and I would talk to them quite frequently. So I mean, it's an interesting relationship. You're not friends exactly, but I really did know a lot about them. And it's such a lonely experience, I think, in some ways, early motherhood. So I think for them, it was sort of nice to have someone to talk to. It's, I mean, it's not like a therapist, but it's someone who's like validating what they're going through and willing to sit and listen. I mean, some of that stuff is so boring to most people. Like, no one really cares, about like the day to day. But, it was great. I could, I asked them really detailed questions. And then, yeah, and those reporters, I mean, that were local and in country with the women were just really amazing and would go and like do a ton of interviewing and videos and photos and all sorts of stuff so that I could use that too in my reporting.
How are they doing now? It's been a couple years. They've got toddlers now.
Yeah, they're good. It was funny. I visited them and their babies were all like close to 3, and it was just amazing because they were the same age but in totally different places. I went directly from Finland to Kenya, and then it was like the same developmental stage, I remember, in just a totally different environment. But they're all, yeah, they're like settling into motherhood. I think they're all pretty good. None of them have more kids yet, and I think that was sort of a product of what happened with their different stories in some ways. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm curious about that. I mean, did Anna in Finland had an older
Yeah.
child, so she was in a bit of a different situation, and she'd maybe be the one that I would assume had that been her first child, maybe she would have, I don't know, maybe not with that partner, but like felt like she had the support. But I mean, in the case of Chelsea in Kenya, like things were so hard with her work situation that it just seemed like it may be insurmountable. And similarly with Sarah in Utah,
Yeah.
maybe less so with Sukasa because she was kind of navigating things. I don't know, but I guess my question is, um, do you get the sense that it's an explicit choice that like, you know, it's kind of unusual to find 3 mothers in
Mhm.
this case who right now are choosing with like 3-year-olds that maybe that's it.
Yeah. No, that's true. I mean, I think policy played a big role. I talked to Sarah again and she said, I think my school district is going to start doing like I can't remember, it was, I think, longer paid leave. And she was like, so maybe I will have another one. There was something like, yeah, like that'll do it. Like it actually, the circumstances change. And I think she does want more kids. Sukasa wanted more kids. And then, it was so hard to balance working and being a mom in Japan because she got reassigned when she went back to work and they assigned her to a different job in a different location 90 minutes away.
Which was like perfectly legal, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
They're supposed to try to put you back in the same place,
Right.
but it's not a guarantee. And so yeah, it was like really tough. And she ended up quitting her job and then she couldn't afford to have more kids, which is like exactly counter to what the Japanese government is trying to do. They're trying to get people to have more kids and like provide all these services, and then it runs up against these
Well,
problems.
and speaking of which, obviously a lot of the political conversation here, which we also talked about in the NewsHour interview, but there's ideas of a motherhood bonus, giving a national American Mother Award if you have like more than 6 kids or something
Okay.
like that. I mean, there's just a lot of talk right now about like how do we boost the birth rate because there is a large segment who believe that that is a imminent crisis. Um, and so, I mean, you experienced some of this in Japan, which I thought was super interesting.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what did you learn about like what policies actually do help parents, moms feel like they can have more children and the world won't come crashing down around them. And incidentally, it also seems like a conversation that like previous generations really weren't having. I don't
Yeah.
know. And
No,
that's 2 very
it's
different
true.
questions, so I just threw a lot at you.
I know. Just solve the demographic crisis.
Yeah, solve it. We have
Yeah.
10 minutes.
I don't know. I do think there's some element of it that's, people feel like they have a choice, which is great, whether or not to have kids. And so women are acting out of, agency, and that's good. I mean, the problem is obviously that women and families that want more kids and are stopping before they have the number that they want. There was some survey that found, a good number of families were stopping short. They were having 2 kids instead of 3, 1 instead of 2, sort of a thing. And the major issue was the cost of childcare. So, it's just adding another one just adds a huge expense. Yeah. And I will say, like in Japan, we did get a cash bonus, and there was no way that it was going to like incentivize me to have another child. Like it was nice to have. I was grateful for it, but like
Sure.
definitely not planning my family around it. So I think, and interest, Japan is similarly like some of these ideas come from men who have been in government for a very long time, for decades, and are sort of completely out of touch with the reality of what young women who are having children actually want. And so it is sort of funny. I feel like I got sort of a preview of what what's coming here when we were living in Japan.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah. My husband, who also lived in Japan for a few years, would say that like Japan's like living like 5 years in the future. Um,
Yeah.
but you know, I know that you, one of the theses that you thought about when you set out to write this book was like who's doing it well.
Mm.
And I know that that ended up really not being something that you answer head on. It's maybe an impossible to answer question. But I do wonder, I'm sure there were things that you found in all the cases that were working in a good way. And so perhaps
Yeah.
you know, we wrap up this conversation talking about, you know, a few things from each country, culture, uh, set of policies that you thought, you know, any government should and any group of people could learn from and benefit from.
Yeah. I mean, the thing about Finland and that group of countries is that they are sort of fine tuning it. So it's like Sweden will do something and see if it works, and then Finland will do it. So there's this like really interesting interplay. Like Finland had this child care allowance that was essentially paying moms to take care of their kids, up till 3, and they realized it was women were leaving the workforce, so it wasn't really working. So Sweden got rid of theirs. So it's like they're thinking about it. It's sort of incredible to so in some ways there's you know, trying out and seeing what works. There's so much research there now from what they've done. And I think the flexibility in Finland is just huge, and the agency that it gives mothers to sort of pursue what they want. And then, Japan and Kenya both have these really beautiful postpartum cultures that are actually very similar to each other. There's this tradition in both places of women staying inside for a month and all the women in their community coming over and bringing them food and like socializing with them and taking care of all the work, so they can just kind of hang out. And I talked to this 90-year-old woman in Kenya who was telling me she like remembered it so fondly. Like it was one of the best periods of her life because she was just sort of, hanging out with her friends, and it was lovely. And it was so different from, the experience most American modern women have. And I just thought it was very cool that, Japan and a lot of Asia has that same tradition of sitting the month afterwards. So like clearly these two societies on other sides of the globe had arrived at the same place. Like there's some ancient wisdom there that we should listen to, And so what Finland has done is sort of try to support it in a public way. And Japan is doing that now too. Now there's public places you can go for a month. If your parents can't take care of you, you can go and be taken care of by, the public health system nurses. So in some ways, just creating that again. And then, in the US, it's like it costs like $800 a night to go to these birth hotel, postpartum retreats or whatever. So we're sort of doing it in our own in our own way. But yeah, but I think you can learn some of
Capitalist,
that. Yeah.
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 And um, another thing that I mean, in the 2 minutes we have left, I loved just it was actually something that the partner in Finland said, I believe, that was like, you have to take care of the mother,
Mm.
like the mother's well-being is paramount.
Yeah.
That seems to be something that like isn't isn't considered kind of common sense in some places, it seems. And I don't
Right.
know, like, do you think that this country is getting better about recognizing that the well-being of the mother will lead to better well-being of the child?
I mean, I would hope so, but I sort of feel like it's not really, it's just sort of not how anyone thinks about these. It's still the priority is often on the children and thinking about children's health and stuff like that. And I think the mother's health is often sort of deprioritized. I mean, there's more understanding of that stuff. But when you go to these, in Finland, it was true that her public health nurse told her, like when she was having trouble breastfeeding, well, put your own needs first because you'll be a better mom then. And I mean, some people, there is that philosophy here too, but I just think generally it's sort of like you're on your own and like go, look for breastfeeding hacks online, or try to sort of solve these problems yourself in some ways. And it's not, I do think that women are not as encouraged to put their own, you know, well-being first, and that's to the detriment of society. Yeah.
But that again is why it's so important that we have books like yours, because
Very-
but we see how other countries are doing it. And
Yeah, no, I think it's hopeful. I think there's a lot of great ideas out there, and we can listen to them and we can take ideas that, are new ideas, or that, like I said, like these incredible traditions that we could bring back in some modern way. I think there's a lot of hope for things getting better, and there's so much more attention to this now, for sure.
absolutely. Well, and this book is a major part of that. So Abigail Leonard, everybody.
Thank you so much, Ali, for doing it. It was great.
Thank you all for being with us tonight. Another round of applause. Wonderful. Thank you to our Zoom audience for joining us. We are going to take just a moment to reset our space. If you need to purchase a book, they're available upstairs. We have plenty of copies. We will take a moment to set the chairs aside. If you are willing and able, we'll pull out a table and then we'll be back out shortly. Thank you so much for being here and happy Mother's Day.